Anna's going to moderate our forum. Thank you. Welcome back. And I'm going to introduce Anna Esselment. Anna, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. I was going to say, do you want me to introduce myself?
Yeah, go for it. Yeah. Anna Esselment is professor of political science at University of Waterloo, a member of the board of the Laurier Institute for the Study of Public Opinion and Policy. And she is going to moderate our election roundtable, our lunchtime roundtable on the Ontario election that just happened. Go for it. Anna, please.
Great. Thanks so much, Simon. And thanks, everybody. It's been a really great forum so far. I've really enjoyed listening to all the presentations. So I'm really happy to be here today with, I'm going to say my good friend, Darrell, and my good friend, Andrea. But no, we've got two great observers of politics and elections with us. So we have, everybody knows, Darrell Bricker, CEO of Public Affairs for Ipsos. Darrell earned his PhD at Carleton University, but is an alumnus of Wilfrid Laurier and has been a very good friend to Laurier for a long time, in particular with sharing Ipsos data for students and researchers at the university to study new trends and patterns in public opinion, which is a real boon for Laurier. It's a real advantage to have that partnership with Ipsos. We also have Andrea Perrella, who I've known for a number of years, who's an associate professor of political science in the Department of Political Science at Laurier. And Andre earned his PhD at the University of Montreal and former director of LISPOP, so has some good connections. So today I'm going to turn it over probably first to Darrell and then to Andre to talk about the recent provincial election and issues of affordability and housing and what we've been talking about today and trends that happen with that election when we consider how important this particular issue is and the rate of voter turnout. It makes me kind of sad as a citizen, but I'm very interested to hear the perspectives of both of our guests for this particular panel. So Darrell, I'll turn it over to you. I'll probably give you about, I don't know, 8 minutes or so, and then the same for Andre.
Okay. I don't know if I've got 8 minutes, Anna.
Oh, okay. No, that's fine. No, so then you can chat and then Andre can chat and then there'll probably be some good questions. So we can spend the rest of the time for that.
Yeah, we'll put the weight on the participants. That's rather than Andre and I doing all the talking, although Andre may have a lot to say. I don't know. I mean, the outcome was more or less predicated by the situation that was happening in the province prior to the election, and I don't think anybody was surprised by what happened on election day. But what was one surprising issue was that I have never seen housing show up as a significant issue in a political campaign when we go out and we ask people the question, what are the most important issues in this election? Housing came up. But the interesting thing about housing, while it was important, it wasn't decisive. And the reason for that was when the public looked at the three political parties, even though they did talk about housing in their platforms, they really, the different options that were offered by the parties didn't really break through with voters. And then the next thing was, given, and I'm going to talk about the character of the issue in just a second, but given the character of the issue, it didn't land naturally with the branding of any of the three parties. So it wasn't like for, compassion, the NDP tends to do pretty well. The conservatives progressive conservatives tend to do pretty well on anything that relates to economic management, particularly when you think about it as, the big E economy instead of, kitchen table type economics. So it wasn't really landing with them. And the Liberal Party can kind of go back and forth depending on the condition of either the NDP or the Progressive Conservatives as being the potential advocate on either one side or the other of that, which is, a wonderful place to be when you're trying to win a Canadian election, which is you can bring people together in the middle. So voters were really telling us in our polling that housing was a very important issue. It wasn't significant in terms of how they decided to vote, mainly for the reason I just gave, was people didn't catch on to any of the options that were being offered by the parties and didn't really see any of the parties as being the natural advocate on housing. And the reason for that is because the housing issue has changed for voters. So we've been tracking this for years and years and years and years. And when usually you ask about housing on an election survey, people read it in the following way. I ask you about housing and I'm thinking the homeless, and I'm thinking low income housing, principally for people living in urban areas. So that's how I read into that question, my answer, what they're being asked to talk about. What's changed in the space of the last year most significantly is that issue is being read in another way now. In the way that it's being read as is basically access to middle-class housing, principally suburban. And this is not really about the affordability of accommodation. It's really about whether or not people feel that they will be able to achieve a life accomplishment that they hold as a critical symbol of life success. And that's owning your own patch, which doesn't mean owning your own condo, which doesn't mean having an affordable apartment to rent. For them, it means I have my patch with my lawn, with my driveway where I can raise my family and live my life. I've been able to achieve what it is that I set out to achieve with all of the things that I've been doing in my life, career-wise, education-wise, the way I've been managing my own money, that kind of thing. So what's happened is we've seen a transformation in the issue. It's moved from being about affordable accommodation and dealing with people who are in dire circumstances when it comes to housing to being really one that resonates very strongly with middle-class voters about this idea of middle-class achievement. And that's where none of the three parties were able to really connect with voters. They didn't see any of them as really being able to satisfy that. And as a result, even though they said it was important, they moved past it and they were voting on other things.
Good. Thank you very much, Darrell. Yeah, just even as I look, and Andrea, I'll turn it to you, but I was thinking the same, sort of a bit along the same lines with our students at the universities who are having a lot of trouble with housing, and parents who thought that their kids would be able to find something around here and are very upset that there's not even apartments for their children at university. Andre.
Thank you, Anna, and thank you, Darrell. I think I have 8 minutes as well, and pretty much all what I have to say corroborates what you just said. And by the way, Anna, I have a lot of students this year who are commuting not because they like to commute, because they have no choice. So this is an unusual period that we're noticing, this post-pandemic when we're now fully in person, and we're seeing a lot of students who are unable to find affordable anything in KW. We've become an expensive city like never before. So this is a problem that I'm seeing in my classroom. Students are coming in late, and I have to start my classes late because they're coming in from Toronto, and you know what that's like. So this is a problem that we're seeing in front of us. So anyway, I'm going to be looking at housing as an election issue, and like I said, much of what I wish to present here matches up exactly what Darrell just said. I'm going to be relying on the Ontario election survey that was coordinated by LISPOP and other partners that was conducted during the campaign of the 2022 Ontario election. And one interesting question, there's a question that is asked in almost every election survey, and that is, what is the top problem? But usually they give you a list, and respondents can pick from that list. In our survey, it was an open-ended question, so which I prefer. It's a bit more tedious from the coding side, because then you got to take everybody's thoughts and answers and try to make some sense out of them, as opposed to them just picking from a list, from a multiple choice list. But I often wonder, if you give people a list, it's like when you go to a restaurant and you don't know what you want to eat, and then you look at the menu, it's like, oh yeah, I think I want that because it looks good. So maybe the list prompts an idea that otherwise was not front and center. So by not prompting people, they just told you whatever it is that's on their mind. And I think that's a more natural way to measure public opinion. More tedious, a lot more work on our side, but I don't mind the work if we're going to get to the answer. And to a large extent, Darrell's data, I'm sure, matches up with this data, that indeed housing was up there, but so was inflation and cost, and the common other issues that people cite in almost every election, such as healthcare and the economy. But housing wasn't top. And maybe part of the housing concern is wrapped up in what people say about cost of living. And now, when I see cost of living as a top problem for, or most important issue for a voter, it could be groceries, it could be gasoline, but it could also be affordability of shelter. So that's not entirely clear, but a whole lot of people indicated housing or some version of the theme of housing, either it's rents or mortgages or just plain lack of housing or lack of affordable housing. And so we got a good number of people who've indicated that. And now the question that we ask is, how important was this issue in terms of defining how one votes? And again, I'm not going to say anything that contradicts what Darrell just said, because it seems like it's an important issue, but it wasn't decisive. And in terms of, according to party support, what percentage of people indicated housing, you can see that NDPers, or those who support the NDP, have cited housing to a greater extent than those who supported other parties. The Liberal Party is a second place. The Progressive Conservative, like those who supported the Progressive Conservative Party, are least likely to have indicated housing as a most important issue. But the contrasts are not that stark. So that's one thing to keep in mind here. Now, there was another question that was asked in the survey that was interesting. It's a series of questions that ask people how easy or how affordable is $800 a month, $1,200 a month, and the list went on to more and more expensive rates. And this can be used to determine like what capacity does somebody have to afford a certain type of expense. I use it to measure affordability. And you can see that those who are most able to afford housing are more likely to have supported the Progressive Conservatives, and those least likely were more likely to have supported other parties, namely, I guess, the Green Party or the NDP. But again, it's not a very stark pattern. It's not a pattern that terribly distinguishes the voters from one to the other. I also conducted, I'm not going to show you any complex tables here, but I have also conducted a fairly thorough regression analysis on vote choice, using a whole bunch of different variables, including the top issues, including issues of housing and cost and so forth. And it wasn't statistically significant, which means it wasn't really a factor at all. Again, housing was a concern among many voters, but it didn't drive them to vote for one party or another. And perhaps and I'm convinced it's for the exact same reasons that Darrell outlined. The parties didn't put forward a compelling reason on why voters should vote for them in order to address their concerns about housing. But what you see here is, in terms of all of the issues that I was able to track, that the Progressive Conservatives seems to have captured the probability of voting Progressive Conservatives is highest across all issue groups, except for a couple of them, like healthcare, where the NDP edges out a little bit, but the three main parties are virtually tied. And the environment, where for someone for whom the environment or climate change is a top issue, they're more likely to have voted Liberal or maybe NDP. But apart from that, there's really no pattern. There's really no discernible pattern. So what this really suggests is, yeah, maybe housing, maybe cost, these were all concerns, but these concerns did not match up with party preferences, other than voting for the incumbent. And it may not be at all related to issue. It may be that a lot of people were going to vote Conservative anyway. And if anything, if I can put a little note here, the strongest determinant of how you voted in 2022 is how you voted in 2018. So the issues they matter in terms of concern, but they did not matter in terms of vote choice. And by the way, another little footnote, in all of those open-ended responses on what is the most important issue, nobody mentioned hydroelectricity. If you recall, in 2018, that was a big issue. Nobody mentioned hydro rates or the management of Ontario's electricity grid. It's just interesting how an issue that was seemingly central 4 years ago has disappeared entirely. But that's just, again, an indication of maybe how fickle public opinion is, but also how difficult it is sometimes to connect an issue with a particular party. And finally, in terms of that affordability scale that I mentioned earlier, again, nothing surprising here that the more one is able to afford more and more expensive shelters, the more likely they will have voted progressive conservative or indicated support for the progressive conservatives. And the less likely they will have supported the NDP or other parties. But really, the slopes here are very shallow. I cannot say that we found the connection between housing and the 2022 vote. It was an issue, but it wasn't an issue that determined the vote. Again, this is exactly what Darrell just said, that it wasn't decisive. And in my analysis, it didn't matter at all. Other issues may have mattered, or other factors may have mattered, but the issues seemingly did not matter. And housing in particular, despite the crises that we're facing, did not seem to have moved voters. And it could very well be because of low voter turnout, voter fatigue, disengagement, and the fact that the sample may have oversampled those who are engaged, those who are interested in politics. And so the ones that we really, really want to measure and study did not participate in the survey. That's not a fault of the way we administered the survey. That is a challenge across all those who study public opinion. So there may be more to the story than meets the eye here. But overall, again, I don't think housing mattered at all in the last election.
Okay, thanks very much, Andre. I will open it up for questions of our panelists, but maybe I can pose the first one. I mean, if housing was not decisive, and we're used to thinking about housing as was characterized earlier, primarily an issue of homelessness, low-income housing, social housing. But Darrell, as you mentioned, once it starts hitting symbolic, milestones that Canadians have always thought are important, like we're getting to that point. When these issues start to hit the middle class, the upper middle class, when does it become decisive for people? Like, is this something that will be 4 years from now, potentially the issue as this continues? Because my feelings always, when it starts to hit in particular, those motherhood type thing, I don't think that's the right word, but that's when parties have to respond, or voters start to squeeze parties or pressure parties a bit more on those things.
Thanks for that. I've always thought that Daniel Yankelovich had a very good way of looking at these things. Daniel Yankelovich was famous for a lot of things in the United States and global public opinion polling, but he was really famous for something about writing about public deliberation. So how does the public actually come to decisions about various things? What's the right thing to do or the wrong thing to do? And what he said was the first phase of what we go through is awareness. So we start becoming aware that an issue is a problem. And then we start moving on to, okay, well, what are the potential solutions? There's a deliberative aspect of that. I think where we are in terms of Canadian public opinion at the moment is we're still in the awareness formation part of this. We haven't really turned to sorting through what the potential solutions might be. And other than kind of an unfocused view of public institutions and their role in this, we really don't know who to blame for what the problem is. And we certainly don't know who to go to other than just to say government in general, where the solutions might reside. People do obviously understand that what's going on right now in terms of global economic, or going on in terms of economic pressure and inflation, which real people call cost of living, only economists call it inflation. They understand that there's something going on out there in the broader world, but what they haven't figured out is how all of this fits together other than I'm concerned, you've raised my anxiety about this, I'm worried about it, I see the effect in my day-to-day life, but I don't really know what to do about it. And when they don't know what to do about it, in terms of politics, it's difficult to see how your vote can affect it in one direction or another. And in the absence of anything that they would regard as a really good solution, something that becomes kind of popular as a potential good solution, in absence of being able to vote for somebody who's offering that, they really don't know how to process this in a political way. So I think that that's what we saw in the election. I mean, the obvious question then is, why didn't people vote? Because obviously there's a lot of anxiety out there. And what was the most decisive issue? And in my view, the reason that people didn't vote was they didn't want change. Not voting was non-decision making, was actual decision making. And the second thing is that they'd had such a steady appetite of upsets and disruptions over the space of the last 2.5 to 3 years. They wanted to just settle on something and move on easily. So when people don't feel an election is of consequence, they don't show up. And when people don't feel that there is a need to change, they don't show up. So that's what we saw in the election campaign. It wasn't so much a huge endorsement of the government or anything that it had on offer, other than the fact that people really didn't feel like there was a need to change anything at the moment. They weren't voting for anything, but they weren't voting against anything either.
Good, thank you. Allison, I'll turn it to you for a question.
Thanks. So I do have kind of a question, and it's maybe sort of a proposed way of sort of making sense of some of the, of some of these questions that we have here about housing is such a priority, but didn't play a role in the provincial election necessarily. So at the risk of sort of being the housing history person who's always taken us back to the 60s, but I find it very interesting that time period is really interesting to look at. Ontario was the leader of the provinces in housing policy. The development of provincial housing corporations, this was during the Quiet Revolution in Quebec. Provincial housing corporations were Ontario's idea, and all the other provinces came on board, and all the provinces followed Ontario. The vast majority of housing that was built in the 60s and 70s, proportionally, was in Ontario, and specifically in Toronto. Ontario was a leader. But that totally changed in the 1990s with the social housing boondoggle and the reorganization, who does what, downloading that to municipalities. And I wonder if there's been a redefinition in Ontario that the province isn't responsible for this. And that Doug Ford's, it kind of drives me crazy, this whole, we're going to overrule municipal zoning decisions because municipalities have caused this and they're the ones who are making affordable housing difficult. But that's kind of what the Conservative government or the PCs were proposing, essentially saying this isn't our fault. What we're going to try to do is make the conditions in the market more favorable to the development of different types of housing and increase supply through sort of overriding municipalities. So I wonder if maybe that's perhaps a reason that people in Ontario maybe don't expect the province to play a leading role in solutions to the housing crisis. And I wonder if in BC, where David Eby, who is very likely to be the next NDP leader and therefore premier, has proposed a very aggressive housing strategy. This includes overriding local zoning decisions, but it also includes $500 million to buy vulnerable rental buildings to protect that housing stock. I wonder if maybe in another province where there is an acute housing crisis, but the province has been more active, I wonder if maybe people might be expecting more of the province. So again, this is maybe a kind of something that I think will be very interesting for people with quantitative skills that I don't have to explore. I wonder what you think about that. And if you think that that might be one of the things that explains the lack of housing as a determinant of vote in Ontario.
Andre, do you want to take that? I've got some views, but I mean, I've already answered a question, so.
And I'm sure my views are not that far from yours. Well, that probably explains why housing may have been a concern, but not an election issue, in the sense that people dissociate housing with the province. And maybe you're onto something. Maybe the fact that the province has delegated everything to municipalities who may not have had the capacity to address housing at the same level, to the same extent as a provincial government can, that now the province is saying, all right, now I'm going to step in where the municipalities are clearly unqualified to do or incompetent in doing. So maybe there is this detachment of how voters attribute the housing portfolio. So we shouldn't expect too much out of voters in terms of their knowledge of which government does what and how involved they are in various sectors. But clearly the signal that the province is responsible for housing is not a very strong signal. And that's reflected in our data. Darrell, you want to add to that?
Yeah, there's a question that every time I do research for a government client, they always ask me in Canada. And it's, should it be a federal, provincial, or municipal responsibility? And the answer is nobody knows. I mean, other than an international incident, which clearly is a federal responsibility, people don't understand the differentiation between the various powers of the various governments. They might understand that the pothole in front of their house is a responsibility of the municipality, but the housing issue, in the way that we've just defined it, which is moving out of just being, dealing with mostly downtown, unaffordable housing and homelessness, this bigger definition of housing, people haven't sorted it out. And as a reason, and as a result of that, really what it is everybody's responsibility. So nobody can really dodge it. So in the next federal election, I'm sure housing will be, as we've defined it in this election, will be an issue. I'm sure in this municipal election that's happening right now, it's going to be an issue. But I guess the point I was making in my earlier comments is not in the way that it's traditionally defined, and not actually in the way that EB is defining it in Vancouver either. While people are, concerned about homelessness, and they're worried about lack of affordable housing for people living downtown, this has become a suburban issue where it's never been an issue before. And that's the active political element that we're seeing that has lifted it from being, in our surveys traditionally, 2-3% when you're talking about a provincial election or municipal election, or sorry, a federal election, 2-3%, up into the numbers that you had, Andre. That's what's lifted it. It's not people's views of the missing middle, or urban density or urban planning. It's not any of that stuff. It's really more about these emotional, aspirational aspects. That's why I said don't think of it as about accommodation. It's another A. It's about aspiration. That's why it's moved up. The accommodation issue has always been there, but it's like 2 or 3%. What moves it into the double digits is the aspiration aspect.
Good. Simon, you have your hand up. I notice it's 12:33, so I don't want to go too far over, but you go ahead and ask your question. Oh, are you talking? Because you might be muted.
Is it possible that it wasn't a motivating issue because the province successfully diffused the issue before the election? So like clearly the provincial government and the Ford government thought that housing was going to be an issue, because if you watched before the election, they had their working group, their roundtable, they were clearly trying to take that off the table, right? With the $1.5 million or million homes, getting 1.5 million homes built. And you could clearly see kind of issues management at work, defusing this issue and sort of punting it, or sort of cobbling together their proposal. So is it possible? And the thing that I noticed is that all three parties actually signed on to the core of that proposal, which was increase the supply of homes built. So is it possible that it didn't determine vote choice because the government successfully defused it as an issue?
I guess my view would be that I don't think they diffused anything. I just think it was happening around the election. It wasn't happening in the election. So what the political actors did was very little, and very little effect on public opinion. And if it had been diffused, it wouldn't be rising as it continues to rise as we go through the rest of the year. I'm not a big believer, honestly, Simon, in the effect of people doing stuff in campaigns. I think we way overestimate. Everybody who wins is a genius, and everybody who loses is an idiot. But the truth is they're all riding waves. It's either going for you or it's going against you. And very little of what you actually do in the campaign affects things. What really caused this election to come out the way that it did was people were just not into the idea of changing anything. They'd been through enough. They just wanted to get past this and move on with their lives. And it wasn't really as much an endorsement of the Ford government as it was an endorsement of just keeping things the status quo. That's basically what happened.
And I think the only thing I would add to that too is that the parties were largely saying the same thing on housing. There actually wasn't a lot of differentiation. So every single party, I think, had 1.5 million, like that was their number. So they all had it. And then they all talked about, you know, the vacancy tax, and then they all had, so there were a number of even their policy ideas for addressing it that converged. So the branding point made earlier is a good one. But even if you were someone interested in looking to see how different are the parties, you know, what's my best options, I think they would find if they read platforms, but we know most voters don't, that they would also have the same menu of ideas from the parties. So you can see why it might not be motivating if you figured whoever wins will, you know, plans to implement the same stuff.
No, I think the election was kind of an irrational, maybe irrational response, because I don't think they expected any of the parties to have a better solution. I think that's what Andre's data were showing. And that, you know, we kind of need a new language to talk about this issue. That's why, you know, in our surveys, we started asking the questions in different ways. Now, obviously, Andre would love to do that, but he doesn't have the resources that we do. So sorry about Andre's situation. But you know, we stopped asking it just as housing. We started to break it into middle class suburban housing versus downtown, you know, homelessness and all that kind of thing. And we saw where the action was. It wasn't on homelessness, or it wasn't on housing the way that people who study housing usually define it. It was in this other whole area. And I don't think that we have the language. I don't think that the public has come to terms with what, you know, what's really needs to be deliberated here. Is it a supply problem? They don't supply problem? Is it a cost problem? You know, they really don't understand at this stage of the game how to take their feelings, because that's basically what it is, and their anxieties, and to play it out in a political way. And that's why it didn't really happen in the election campaign. I don't know if that's rational irrationality or rational irrationality, which way it works, but there was no deliberation of the issue in the campaign, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Great. Well, is there, I think, oh, sorry, Simon.
One last question on that, Darrell. So we grappled with this when we were doing our survey. We were asking the question about, do you want to spend money on, should the government spend less, more, or the same amount of money on affordable housing? And we were grappling with this question is, how do people think of the term affordable housing? Because, you know, by definition, the rising cost of suburban homes makes housing less affordable, right? So it is in there, but affordable housing is traditionally coded in the way that you mentioned, which is it's social housing for those on the margins, right? So methodologically, I guess my question to you to finish off is like what, how do you distinguish, what words do you use to distinguish those two different symbols or sentiments?
Well, I think the first thing is having the experience of being able to see what the pattern of answers to that question have been in the past. So we know on surveys that we ask about housing until fairly recently, it's you know, if there's a list of 20, it's 18, 17. I mean, it ranks fairly low on the list. And when you start seeing it move up to where you guys had it in your survey, and by the way, accurately, we probably had it up and around a similar kind of range in terms of at least its priority, you know, something's happened. So then you just go back to looking at how you've been asking the question and maybe ask a few more questions around it. So, you know, you could ask about, you know, affordability and low-income housing downtown. You can ask it the suburban question that we asked, but you tease it out a little bit to try and get some sense of what you're really dealing with. And what happened during the course of the last 18 months, I would say, is when people answer that question on what's the most important issue, they're saying something different now, or they're meaning something different now than what they meant in the past. And the only clue that we had about that was that the number went up. So the obvious question is, are you more concerned about what it was that you were always saying before. And what we saw was that wasn't the case. It was something different. And as I said, you know, I think I didn't say, but I'll say now, I think the parties were really surprised by it too. I think they didn't quite know what to say, because when they heard housing, you know, they have their minister of housing, or they have their advocates for housing, or they listen to people who usually advocate on behalf of housing. It's not people living in the middle class suburbs saying, hey, I can't have my, you know, my double wide lot with a garage and a nice place to park for my kids to play in. You're usually hearing from people who are saying, hey, I need more density downtown. Well, that's not what's driving this. What's driving this is that other thing. And you know, quite frankly, we just had to think about it another way. And we played with it, and that's what we saw in the data.
Great. Thank you very much, Darrell. And thank you, Andre. That was a good short election roundtable session. So Simon, maybe I'll turn it back over to you for break, or what's planned in the agenda.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Oh, Simon, you're muted. You've muted.
We have a short break. We have a short break, and at 12:45 we'll come back for our first of our 2 community roundtables.